My name is Severina McGill. I teach human rights law at Jindal Law School, and this is for the UGC e-Pathshala. By the end of this module, you'll be aware of the position of women in society within India and globally that demonstrates their inferior social position, why women need specific human rights, and the gender bias present in understanding and implementation of most human rights laws that contemporary society relies on. Women's disadvantaged social position throughout her life is often referred to as the cycle of violence. In India, there is a strong patriarchal culture. This is reflected and manifested in various forms, including son preference and subsequent sex determination-based abortions and female infanticide, more money being spent on male members of the family's education and health, and young men having more choice and control over their access to higher education, their choice of subject, and the location of future employment. Men's age of marriage is also later. Grooms receive and do not have to pay dowry, and men typically have more control over domestic decision-making. For example, the use of contraception, the number and spacing of children, and choices over how the household income is spent. Male control over the ownership of property and land, men having higher social status in their old age and as widowers over widows. Historically, practices such as sati, and when widows were forced to live a life of isolation and poverty in temples, but widowers could continue living in the family home, were also forms of violence that only affected women. The natural global average of sex ratio at birth is around 105 male births per 100 female births. This equates to a naturally occurring 952 female births to 1,000 male births. This difference in the sex ratio at birth is naturally occurring as more male children are likely to die before their second birthday than female children. Therefore, the imbalance should naturally balance out by the time the children are past infancy. In India, the 1991 census showed that there were 948 female births compared to 1,000 male births. As there was social concern that the female birth rate was being artificially interfered with through methods such as female feticide and female infanticide due to socio-cultural preference for male children, the government of India passed a law in 1994 to ban the determining of the sex of fetuses. Despite the Preconception and Prenatal Diagnostic Techniques Act of 1994, by 2012 to 2014, the census figures showed that the sex ratio was 906 per 1,000 live births of boys. The continual decline of the sex ratio, even after the introduction of legislation into sex-based determination, demonstrates that law in itself cannot change social values and pervasive cultural preferences. Feminists have consistently critiqued and challenged human rights laws, arguing that law does not represent and consider the oppressive forms of discrimination most women experience on a daily basis, and therefore cannot be the sole source of a solution to inequality. Historically, women were not included as subjects in the definitions of rights. The life experience and needs of men have been treated as the standard to which rights apply to all people. When torture, disappearance, or bodily injuries are inflicted upon women, the difference in their experiences to what men might experience are often not recognized. Their identities and experiences are co-opted into what the male definition of that experience may have been, and that definition of appropriate redress. Often women's experiences, for example that of rape survivors in the Yugoslavian and Rwandan conflicts, or of half-widows in the conflict in Kashmir, are unrecognized by human rights legal systems, and therefore no specific protections are afforded to them. Specific crimes against women have therefore either gone unnoticed historically and have not been prosecuted, or they have had to be made to fit into the definition of a crime that was not intended to cover such an act. The experience of prosecuting sexual violence as a weapon of war in the former Yugoslavia and in Rwanda are an example of this. Gender myopia, or blindness towards inequalities between men and women, has been constantly playing a role in how the rules of society develop. If women's voices expressing how their experiences differ to those of men are not included and listened to, women are excluded from being able to benefit from human rights laws in their own capacity, for example, as women. Crimes against women in India. According to the National Crime Records Bureau, figures from 2013 show there were a total of 309,546 incidents of crimes against women. Of these, the total number of cognizable offences against women were 52.24 crimes against women per 1 lakh women. Of these offences, the most common crimes in descending order were cruelty by husbands or his relatives, with 118,866 cases, assault on a woman to outrage her modesty, 70,739, kidnapping and abduction, 51,881, rape, 33,707, insult to modesty, 12,589, and dowry at over 8,000 cases. All of the above listed crimes are crimes that are committed against women, overwhelmingly by men. Cruelty, rape, assault, and dowry particularly demonstrate male dominance and violence over women in society. These crimes are typically perpetrated to exert control, to create fear, and to reinforce a social hierarchy of power, both within the family and within society as a whole. They reinforce men's privileged and more powerful social position. A close examination of the kidnapping and abduction figures for women in Delhi by various studies has established that many cases of kidnapping and abduction are filed by young women's parents after the woman has eloped with a lover when she is under the age of majority. This has led Rukmini Sen to ask whether these are cases of bhagna, as in to elope, which is the result of one's exercise of agency or a choice, or bhagna, as in to be forcefully taken away, for example, kidnapped or abducted, without any agency or choice. The parents' filing of FIRs to register the alleged kidnapping demonstrate the parents' lack of approval of the relationship. The filing of a kidnapping as opposed to a lost person report reinforces the notion of daughters as property who are not allowed to make their own decisions, and that any decisions they do take come without the expressed consent of the family must be controlled and curtailed. Control over women's lives and their choices is easier when women are dependent on men for their economic and social survival. According to the UN's Food and Agricultural Organization, women in India account for only 9.5% of landholders. Women's low ownership of land and property results in them being dependent upon male members of their family for their shelter and survival. They may therefore be forced to accept certain living conditions, such as domestic violence, and generally have less influence in decision-making within the home and family, as they have no or significantly less control over resources, access to which may be needed to have a role in decision-making. Not owning land or property also weakens women's access to capital and financial loans that may then increase their ability to make choices based on a wider range of options that includes their agency. Low participation in formal, well-paid employment reinforces women's weaker social position. In 2015, an International Monetary Fund working paper stated at around 33% at the national level in 2012, India's full labour force participation of women is well below the global average of around 50% and the East Asian average of around 63%. In addition, men earn more than women in both the formal and informal sectors. The weak social and economic position of women in society reinforces their inferiority and vulnerability. Combined with a strong patriarchal attitude, the safety of women, even in the public sphere, is less secure than men's. The Delhi gang rape and resulting death of a young 23-year-old student in December 2012 highlighted the disproportionate fear of and threat of actual violence that women experience in the public sphere, whilst accessing leisure activities, transport, and infrastructure. The event triggered mass protests across Delhi and also in many other cities in India, including Calcutta and Bangalore. In many cities, young women were demanding more action and accountability from the police in securing the public safety of women. Internationally, women's social and economic security is less secure than men's. In the UK, 2 women a week are murdered by their current or former partner, and 3 women a week who are in a relationship with an intimate partner violence commit suicide largely because of the stress and mental health consequences of living with or in fear of abuse. To put this in context, on average, 100 women a year are killed by their current or former male partner. A further 156 women are victims of suicide because they are in abusive relationships. These deaths would be easier to prevent if more support services and perpetrator reform programs were being funded. This compares to around 10 men who are killed by their female partner every year. In the USA, the number of American troops killed in Afghanistan and Iraq between 2001 and 2012 was 6,488. The number of American women who were murdered by a current or ex-male partner during the same time period was 11,766. That's nearly double the amount of casualties lost as during war. These statistics highlight the gap in institutional protections for women. When governments are aware that intimate partner violence disproportionately affects one sex over another, we must ask, why are governments not responding more and comprehensively trying to fulfill their human rights obligations to protect women's right to life? A potential reason is the lack of prioritization at the decision-making and budget allocation level. In the USA, in 2014, the federal fiscal year budget allocated $413 million to reinforce efforts to combat and respond to violent crimes against women. These grants are recognized as playing a critical role in helping to create a coordinated community response to the problem of violence against women. They also have a significant role in meeting the needs of almost 1.3 million women annually who are victimized by rape and sexual assault, and the nearly 7 million victims of intimate partner violence every year. This $413 million for a coordinated community response to meet the needs of 8.3 million women a year equates to less than $50 per person. We can also compare this $413 million to other national budgets and see how extremely small the budget actually is. In 2014, the US budget was $176.2 billion for the operations, training and support activities of troops needed to defeat current and future security threats. $166.8 billion to continue a joint strike fighter aircraft program, and $5.4 billion for submarines. There was also a $12 billion budget for strategic offensive forces per year. In the USA, it is estimated that the Victims of Crime Act provides $310 million each year for domestic violence and sexual assault services. This is compared to $640,221 billion in 2013 on the defense budget. This defense budget is higher than the defense budget for the next 8 highest spending countries combined. It therefore prompts one question: what could be spared from this budget and reallocated towards providing domestic violence shelters, social support, rehabilitation, and therapy services for perpetrators and for survivors, early intervention programs and fast-track courts, and training for the police, health, and judicial services on how to recognize and appropriately respond to abusive relationships in an informed and sensitive manner. Gender discrimination negatively affects women in the West, with women consistently earning less than men. More than half a century after the United States passed the Equal Pay Act, and 45 years after the UK passed similar legislation, women across the world earn 77% of the amount paid to men. An international consultancy firm predicted that the UK's gender pay gap, if it continues to decrease at the current level, will not close until 99 years after the equal pay legislation was introduced, or in 2069. And the World Economic Forum estimates that the global pay gap will not close until the year 2186. Motherhood is also financially punished. Over a woman's lifetime, women who have 2 children will earn 25% less than childless women. Further, as women are more likely to be employed in part-time jobs which allow them to better balance family care commitments with employment responsibilities, their pension contributions also cumulatively become less than men's over their lifetime. This is partly due to the fewer hours worked and partly due to less salary being paid, because positions which are more likely to be part-time are also less likely to have as many responsibilities and thus have less status within the workforce. In the UK, women's final pensions at the age of retiring are on average 40% less than men's. As women on average also live longer than men, this means they are much more likely to live in poverty in their old age. Statistics such as these demonstrate an ingrained discrimination against women and a lack of gender sensitivity within the workplace. Why is it that the financial consequences of reproduction, necessary for the survival of the human race, are as a whole disproportionately borne by women? It is often a couple who are choosing to have a child and not one person in isolation. This choice, made by 2 people but physically borne by one, should be better supported. Gender stereotypes have historically played a large role in defining the content of laws and policies, and although many discriminatory laws have been repealed, gender stereotypes persist within culture and law. They play a large role in defining the content of laws and their implementation. Women are often labelled as weak, in need of protection and of looking after, dependent, emotional, sensitive, kind, compassionate, and as enjoying domesticity. Compare this to men, who are often labelled as strong, independent, as natural leaders, and as objective, rational, and logical thinkers, as more selfish and more professionally competitive. Such stereotypes have played a large role in determining the content of parental leave policies. Gender stereotypes that define men as hardworking with fewer emotions and women as naturally more caring and happier within the home are socially constructed. The broad legal recognition in most countries in the world for maternity leave, but very few legal provisions for paternity leave, demonstrates how stereotypes can shape legal provisions. A lack of parental leave for parents removes child-caring decisions from parents and forces women to take time off work, as men simply do not have the same legal rights to parental leave, either at all, or for as long as women, or with pay. The lack of legal rights and protections for men as equal parents places parental leave and caring decisions firmly within the hands of the state. If men want to be the primary carer and they are not given employment protections, they are forced to resign or take only earned or casual leave. Such restrictive policies often force women to take leave even if the couple would have preferred for the man to be the primary caregiver. These policies demonstrate not only gender stereotyping regarding the roles men and women play within the family unit, but also gender pigeonholing. Gender pigeonholing is where movement beyond these stereotypes is restricted by law. Sweden is well known for its gender-neutral parental leave policies. It first introduced parental leave for men 40 years ago and has continued to introduce new policies to encourage men's participation in child rearing. When the policy that enabled men to take leave was first introduced, only 0.5% of all paid parental leave was paid to men. The low uptake of the new policy was likely due to 1. A lack of awareness about the policy and how to access it, but also 2. It demonstrated entrenched social stereotypes that care work for children was seen as feminine, and the existence of social pressure to not break such barriers. The Swedish government has continued to introduce policies to try to break these stereotypes and to provide incentives for men to utilize the provisions available to them. In 1995, the Swedish government announced that for every family where both parents took 1 month of leave, an extra 1 month of paid leave would be given to the family to look after their child. Whilst this policy was gender neutral, it clearly applied to both parents. It was clearly aimed at men who were not taking leave for childcare. This policy quickly came to be known as the Daddy Month. It has been credited as helping to redress the imbalance between men and women in the distribution of childcare decisions. In 2002, it went even further and gave families where both parents took at least 2 months of leave to look after their child an additional 2 months of leave for the family. In 2014, men were taking 25% of all paid parental leave, and the gap between men and women's leave is said to be continually shrinking every year. Recognizing that families often have significant financial commitments, Sweden also provides men and women with 80% of their salary when they take parental leave. If policies do not pay compensation when a parent takes leave, this often forces the highest income earner to stay in employment. When the highest income earner is the male parent, this further forces men into the role of the financial provider for the family, and women as unpaid carers, thus further entrenching gender stereotypes and not trying to provide equal opportunities. This module has introduced how the life cycle of violence against women and girls includes forms of violence that are typically only experienced by women. These forms of violence may be extreme, where they result in the ending of female lives from sex-determined abortions to murder by intimate partners. They may also be more subtle and yet still be pervasive within society, from greater control over women's choices to violence against their person. This is reflected in access to education and employment, ownership of property, and choices that women may not have over their own life direction and bodies that are freely available to men. This module has also given an introduction to how historical lacks of participation of women in significant numbers in decision-making positions has resulted in women's needs often being underfunded and their labour as being undervalued. Women have also been pigeonholed into often unpaid forms of care work. Without laws and policies that aim to promote a more equal and accommodative society that break down socially constructed gender stereotypes and build solutions to encourage greater gender-based equality, women are likely to continue experiencing oppression. Future modules in this course on human rights of women will introduce theories of what equality can be understood to mean, laws and case studies to promote why human rights of women needs greater attention, and how laws can be shaped and structured to increase women's lived real equality. The above examples ranging from the socio-economic position of women in society, which reinforces women's more vulnerable and inferior position socially, the lack of prioritization of women's issues in the allocation of state funds, the lack of laws that do and do not exist, and their gender-insensitive implementation demonstrates why special measures are needed to promote and support the substantive upliftment of women. Thank you.